Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Memory Cheats. This is Prolix, Comix, Bollix, but it does turn out that this time the memory definitely cheats.
Okay. I was wondering where you were going.
We're talking about. Sorry, I should say I'm Nick, and himself there is
Roger.
Roger, yeah. And as we do in this show, we talk about comic books.
Rogering.
Yes, and that too, yeah. Sequential art, all that jazz. And yes, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So martial law is what we're talking about this time. Now, we've already talked about Pat Mills before, more than once, I think, but we definitely talked about his considerably better series Charlie's War.
Yeah, I was wondering. So I'm relieved to hear you start with this tone, because
I think when you read something at 13 and then don't read it again for many years, but think like, oh man, that thing was awesome.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this goes a little like this. Kevin O'Neill sadly died not so long ago. I want to do something showcases how great he was. Oh, fuck, I chose the wrong one. Is that basically?
Yes. If I had it to do over, we would be talking about this. Which I think is probably certainly the high watermark, maybe for Kev as an artist. But although I would say he's not what's letting down martial law.
No. So we should be fair here.
He's not the weak link in this chain.
So first off, let's just say yes, Kevin O'Neill, R.I.P., and we'll talk about how awesome he is, and then apologize for kind of having maybe chosen the wrong thing to highlight his work.
And I suspect probably Kevin O'Neill will be best remembered for this. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yes.
By Alan Moore. Although it's not it's great because it's Kevin, but it's not my favorite of the things that he has done.
It might be my favorite thing that Alan Moore's done.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you there. That, and actually some of his stuff from around that same time, Tom Strong, is also really fun. And there's a few other things he did around that time when he was almost backlashing against himself. And he did some of his most interesting work in that chunk of time. But this is interesting. So I moved to Canada in 1989, and I'm 13 years old. And I have been reading 2000 AD, and we've talked about 2000 AD before, so we won't go on about that ad nauseum. But there's, around the same time,
we'll be returning to it again and again, right? So
yes, I'm afraid so. It's a fairly formative influence
for both of us. So you can't really get away. To be honest, though, I think it's also what's interesting is, sorry to derail you there, but I think it's so many people come from the point of view of being anchored by DC Marvel.
Yes.
It's kind of I think it's kind of maybe kind of interesting where the anchor is something very different.
Yes.
In a way.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, I just
thought and in fact, and this is interesting to me. So that 2000 AD, and specifically its artists and creators, were my entry point into DC and Marvel. Right. I really had no interest in Batman or Superman or any of this stuff until I found out that, Alan Moore has gone off and he's written The Killing Joke, and he's, done this thing Watchmen for DC, and then it looks like Pat Mills has gone off and is working for Epic, which was an imprint of Marvel Comics, right? And then John Wagner and Alan Grant, who had done Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog, they were then at this point, all around this kind of late 80s, early 90s, they all were doing, either they directly went and just worked for the Americans, or they were had a foot in both camps. They were still doing stuff in England, but also doing stuff there. So, and I think it was like Seattle in like
it's weird. That's exactly what I was going to say. We're both unfortunate enough that kind of two really kind of huge zeitgeisty influential things when we were growing up that hit us at exactly the right age
Right.
haven't aged well.
Yes, yes, exactly. So it feels a bit like unfortunately they were getting down to their Mudhoneys and their Temple of the Dogs and stuff
Oh,
by the
don't
time.
put Mudhoney in with that. Mudhoney were better than
All
that.
right.
Yeah.
All right. But yeah, it's not all going to be Nirvana, and so, you know, as it turns out, what I remembered fondly as kind of like a edgy, like funny, kind of like sticking it to the superheroes thing, turns out to be kind of shit, as it turns out. Very
Yes.
nicely drawn.
Not a
very
little
nicely
strong,
drawn.
but yes. Oh, yeah. Well, that's the thing. That is the best thing about it is, and we're not just saying that because the man's dead. It's true. And it's interesting that because his artwork, that's a very loud lawnmower. I don't know if you can hear that.
No, I can't.
Okay, good.
So this is an actual paper copy
Yeah,
of MARSHAL from the time.
I had never read martial law before, but it's interesting reading it. It immediately put me back into a time and place where, and you can probably contextualize this better than I can, but there's something, I don't know what you'd call this style, but there's something about this style that just screams this time, not just this time period, but that, yeah, like you said, that kind of crossover where there was this impetus to do superhero things from a more adult or a darker
Right.
place, or,
Right.
and this look epitomizes that to me. So I'm wondering how much is that other people copying what Kevin O'Neill was doing, or Kevin O'Neill kind of maybe piggybacking on someone else, or like how does he fit into that?
Well,
what was it like Toxic and some other?
Yes, which all of that comes just a little bit after this. I mean, and Toxic featured martial law, right? So, but after this original American run for Epic. So, I mean, that's a great thing. So, as I was reading this, that's a great set of thoughts you had there, Clive. As I was reading this,
thank you, sir.
It really mustache. So yeah, as I was reading this, I was and still do. There's a cartoon on Adult Swim called The Venture Brothers, which was started out as a sort of a parody of like what the fuck is it called? It was one of those like 60s cartoon shows, Johnny Quest, right? It was basically a parody of Johnny Quest. But when rereading this, I was like, wow, did they really, like, especially when they get more and more into kind of parodying DC and Marvel kind of characters and stuff, some of it just looks like it's taken directly out of martial law. And I was really, like, I was taken aback actually by the extent to which those creators borrowed from this. And I think things like The Boys, which is that TV series and stuff about asshole superheroes, which is based on, I can't remember which of the, but one of those big, maybe Garth Ennis, one of those Irish, guys who are later 2000 AD, and then the next generation who went off to the States and made their money. But yeah, so in that way, yeah, I mean, obviously this is like the Watchmen done with a much broader strokes.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I suppose it's the two things you have to compare, right? Because they're more or less contemporaries, right? They would have been.
Yes. This just comes a year or two afterwards, and very much obviously Pat Mills was like, I'm gonna do my deconstruction of the superhero, but I'm gonna do it like in typical Pat Mills fashion, like really broad and two-fisted and a bit less of the high cerebral. But the thing is, in fairness to Pat, like when he's good, he's really good. That's when he's doing Slaying the Horn God, he's brilliant. When he's doing
that's
Charlie,
the thing that surprised me about this was the fact that the
but there is lots of Pat Mills like this too.
And Kevin O'Neill was just again, even though I love the look of it, but and the actual the look of martial law himself as well.
Yes, actually so Nazi, which I forgot. Like as a kid, I didn't really quite catch it until I was looking at it this time. I was like, wow, that's a strange choice for your superhero to have him look like an SS officer.
But before we lose the train of thought, because so where I mean, is Kevin O'Neill ground zero for this, or is he?
I think so.
Okay.
I think Kevin O'Neill is Kevin O'Neill. I mean, Kevin.
Well, that's what I would have been surprised if you'd have told me that wasn't the case, because he just seems to have been. Yeah, is it just someone who...
He almost came fully formed, like at the age of. So like very quickly, like a potted history of Kevin is that he went to work for like IPC Comics at some ridiculously early age, like 14 or 15, right? And initially, one of his jobs was he was what's called a bodger, which is basically somebody who fixes up other shit artwork by whiting parts out and redrawing bits and stuff. Right. So he really paid his dues. But very quickly, he proved himself to be a truly gifted artist. And, I have my favorite period of his work, which is a little bit, he gets more and more kind of angular and kind of like sketchy looking as his work goes on. I quite like there's this mid phase of his work where it's not as roundy and curvilinear and it's getting a bit more jagged, but it's not as full on, over the top as this stuff.
What I like about Kevin O'Neill stuff in general, as well, is he does this thing, and I'm not quite sure how, like you said, he's clearly a very, very gifted artist, but he seems to be always like trying to draw like ahead of himself or something.
Yes,
so it's like it's not that it's, of course it's accomplished and it's great, but it feels almost as if it's not quite what he wants it to be. Like he feels like he's really striving for something.
Yes.
Like it's always a work in progress. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just, it feels like, I don't know what's in his head, but this isn't, I feel as if it's like, you feel as if he's never quite doing but it's so fantastic and brilliant and leads ahead of most other people. It's like, but do you know what I mean? It doesn't feel as if like he's pleased with it or something. It's like
right.
This will do for now, kind of thing. And you like he's chasing something.
No, I would agree. And Pat Mills once said about like some of his early work on Nemesis, he did some incredibly beautiful kind of proto steampunk stuff that he's never really been credited with. Really almost inventing a lot of stuff that like he's so easy to borrow from because he's so brilliant that people wouldn't even necessarily notice that that's a crib from Kevin O'Neill, but he's such a fertile imagination. But yeah, so one of my favorite stories about him, which you probably already know or may know, so whenever all of these artists were making this transition over to American comics, Alan Moore wrote a couple of stories for like Green Lantern and had Kevin draw them, and DC were kind of like, ugh, like what's this? Like what kind of art is this? And anyway, but they were like, all right, so it's like we'll do it for Alan. They took it to the Comics Code Authority, which in those days, if your comic didn't have that stamp of approval from the Comics Code, you basically couldn't put it out, right? This is at some point we'll have to read a book about the comic scare and about Frederick Wortham and all that shit, because I think it's important for us to know more about it. But anyway, after comics kind of implode, with the EC stuff and parents get all up in arms and there's this witch hunt, the Comics Code Authority is created, and if you don't have that stamp on your comic, and it's run or overseen by the fucking guy Victor. Maybe Victor Bollix is the wrong person, but anyway, but it's the guy who did Archie Comics, is the guy who somehow also runs the Comics Code Authority or has like final say. Anyway, the artwork is submitted to them, and they're like, "You remember Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer?"
Yes.
Do you remember what happened when he submits that film, right? And they're like, "Yeah, no." And he's like, "No, like what cuts do you need me to make?" And they're like, "Nope."
Right.
There are no cuts you can make to this that will allow us to put it out with like an R rating. The whole film is contaminated. Every cell of the film is, and that happens with Kev. He is told, "Yeah, no, your art is not Comics Code okay." And the same thing, he's like, "Well, could I redraw something?" He's like, "No, your whatever you're doing, your entire
don't
style
do
is
that.
not
Yeah.
cool young people. So
Right.
please don't do it anymore.
And you look like a football hooligan.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so he said, I mean, he famously said, I'm the only artist ever to be banned by the Comics Code Authority based entirely on how I draw. Like, my style of drawing is not considered to be.
The thing is, I understand, because there is some there. Yeah,
Deeply unwholesome about Kevin.
there's something, isn't there? There's just, and then you, and again, I never met him, but from did you ever meet him?
No, I wish. God damn.
From what I've heard, he was a thoroughly nice fella, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
But he does have that slight look about him as well. There's like, you expect him to just glass you or something, like if you say the wrong thing. So he's like the comics thug or something. He's just got something about him, like a really evil twinkle, like a Alex the Droog kind of thing going.
As a kid, I would get completely lost in this kind of like meat and maggot mesh stuff that he was doing for like a kid's comic, and I would just be like, holy like how, but 2018 was, I guess, they were a little bit faster and looser back then with what they thought kids could and should be allowed to see. Whereas, so Epic Comics is one of these offshoots. So basically DC creates a thing called Vertigo, right? Which they need to do because once Alan Moore starts doing things like Swamp Thing, and then, Neil Gaiman starts doing stuff that's a bit edgier and has serial killers in it. So Marvel kind of does the same thing. They create Epic Comics, which is their same, an imprint where they can not put that comics code on there, and they can just put it out, and it can have. But the issue is like, so here's, and we've used this. I use this analogy way too much, but of Seijun Suzuki, where I still feel like some of his best work, or he feels his best work, was done under the constraints of like the studio system,
right?
And he kind of
against the pricks, right?
Yeah. And this is for me a case of like, maybe Pat is best when he has a stronger editorial hand and somebody's kind of being like, this is not edgy. This is just kind of sophomoric and kind of like childish in a way.
Well, that's the
like
thing.
This is
you can
trying to shop your mum or something.
You can forgive the 10-year-old you for
yes,
but this is grown men writing it, right? So that's kind of, of course you have to. It's very difficult because it's very difficult to quantify, but you do have to figure in just the times as well, right? How things have changed.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to quantify that. So it's but you can't discount it because that's definitely an element. But it's just difficult to put into. You can't really explain it, but it's definitely an element.
No, you're absolutely right. I think so. Maybe really, really quickly, I'm going to give you the shortest possible version of what this story is. So we are in a near future, which is, I think, now the past, probably based on the years given in the story, where there has been a Third World War kind of a conflict, but a low level, like not a big nuclear conflict, but like basically, like a Vietnam type of conflict in South America, where a bunch of people went off, and this is kind of a nod towards Captain America, have gone off and had like a super soldier serum injected, and they become superhero soldiers, and they've all gone off to fight in this really shitty, kind of depressing jungle conflict thing. And this is something that Pat Mills was kind of obsessed with at this time, because he was doing at the same time this comic called Crisis, which was 2000 AD's more serious adult, sister publication.
Another thing I wonder how dated some of that stuff.
Oh, that would be, I have no doubt that would be hard to read. Although, first time I ever saw Lyrics by the Dead Kennedys or Chumbawamba, weirdly enough, before I heard the bands when I was an 11-year-old, was reading them in, there was a punk character who would sometimes be listening to music. But yeah, so in that story as well, he had a bunch of like he seemed to be convinced that there was going to be another Vietnam in South America, because it comes up multiple of his stories written around this time. And maybe there was, there was Nicaragua, there was, there was some stuff going on, Grenada, right? So maybe
it just seemed to have been a lot more contained, right? And I think at that point, oh, we've got all political, but it was like I think the powers that be had evolved to the point where they were like, okay, it's not a good look to
be doing this in our backyard.
Yeah, so we do it via, you know, coups and
proxies,
and
yes, yeah,
like
exactly,
that.
yeah.
And we get the we get the local rather than sending our boys over there. It doesn't seem very popular with the American public.
Yes, so we'll just pay the right people to kill the commies,
right,
and trade unionists. Anyway, it's in the story. This has happened, and then this war conflict has ended, and all of these, super powered PTSD vets have come back into the States, right? And they're called SERPs, surplus heroes. They're no longer needed. A lot of them are on the streets, which, I mean, in that way is probably true to the time and maybe even more prescient.
It's not
it's not like it's not. Yes, it's just what he does with it. And so one of these people is this guy called Joe Gilmore, who has been one of these super soldiers, but he's filled with self-loathing about the atrocities he was part of. They can't feel pain. They've been given this kind of neural block or whatever that means they can't feel pain. And so in the argument is that it creates, worse atrocities because they need to see pain in others because they can no longer feel it themselves. They're all back. And then there's been also, just to add matters, there's been a massive earthquake in California that's kind of leveled San Francisco. And so it's been, out of the ashes has arisen this new city, San Futuro. And martial law, who was this one-time soldier, is now a kind of super Judge Dreddy fascist cop whose job is killing other heroes.
Yes.
That's basically
where the Watchmen connection comes in there.
Yeah. And that's basically where we're at. And then as the story goes on, there's this Superman kind of analog character, this guy who was an earlier superhero who didn't hang around to be part of this conflict, but inspired all of these other young men to go off and get the injections. But he's flown off to space and has come back at the same age he left, basically, right? And this is kind of, and then and there's also a murder. There's a serial rapist murderer guy wandering around the city, killing women dressed as this Superman guy's present girlfriend, and this is kind of the mystery. But
it sounds a lot better than it is.
It does. Yes, unfortunately, and by the time you get to the end, like the last issue is just like, it's Pat Mills at his worst. It's like a history lesson / harangue. There's like the story's just gone out the window by that point. Like there's no, and then have you heard the term fridging before?
No, but it sounds like something I should get into.
No, maybe not. And I should know who it is. I think it was a like a feminist comics critic and comics fan. There's and I don't know what it is. It's in some comic that's quite well known, like DC Comics, like The Flash or something like that. Where there was quite a well-liked female character. She was a girlfriend of the hero, and in one episode he comes home and opens up his fridge, and she's been murdered and dismembered and stuffed into the fridge. And so this term fridging came about to basically to deal with the number of stories written for boys that have female characters who are likable murdered just to give the male hero something to get revenge for or motivation. And so fridging has become this term, and so it's now used quite often when we see this, because it's still it's still all over the place, right?
Well, let's talk about then. So this interests me as well, and again, I'm not well informed enough to talk about it. So this is where you come in again to lead me by the hand. And so there seems to be a bit of a pause or something. So you have this and Watchmen, and like we said, this other crisis and that, but the Killing Joke and stuff like that. And there seems to be a little bit like there's some people like us, for example, I suppose, who either read that stuff like you did, a lot of it when it was new, and then go back to it with fresh eyes, or people like me who didn't even read a lot of it the first time, and I'm reading it for the first time, and I'm going back and kind of, yeah, maybe not kind of thinking.
It's a time capsule. It's a time capsule, but it's not necessarily good.
Yeah. For instance, I didn't mind reading, like, in some ways there was elements of martial law that I found conceptually more interesting than some of the stuff in Watchmen.
Right.
It's just the manifestation of it. And again, I really like the artwork. I have to stress that the artwork is fantastic. But it seems to me, but in general, there seems to be this weird kind of and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm far from up to date, but there seems to be this strange, like, so you mentioned things like The Boys and actually they did Watchmen not that long ago as a miniseries.
Yes, HBO.
There seems to be this kind of strange reverence for, like, it's almost as if that period where there was like this kind of so-called revolution in comics, which which does seem a little if you look at it, it seems a little overblown in retrospect, and a child's tantrum kind of, rather than epoch. But it seems to still, we seem to be in some kind of weird reverential fallout. Like I feel as if a lot of people still feel that that's, I don't know, like
with some kind of high watermark for comics. Yes.
Yeah, and plus there's still kind of, well, something, I haven't seen The Boys and I've heard it's actually quite good, and of course it's a slightly different medium and different mediums have different, the trail behind or whatever, but I feel as if, like, I wouldn't be surprised to see, like, if someone decided to adapt martial law, for instance,
right,
and they might not even change it that much, or the things they would change about would be, I don't know, they'd tone it down in some regards, but I feel as if other elements, some of the worst elements, would still survive.
Yes, yeah, I think so. And you know what, this is another thing that really, I'm going back and rereading some, and again, I feel like I'm beating up on poor Pat, and that's not really fair, for various different reasons. And I don't know, I'd be interested to know how he would address some of these things that to me, when rereading the stuff as an older person, kind of really jump out at me. But even at the time, sort of did. Is because it also shows up in Slain, like, a lot, a tendency to create it's like just to the line of gay bashing, or maybe over the line of gay bashing. And it's a weird thing for somebody who seems so progressive in some ways, like when it comes to like issues of race, or to some degree, this is not a great example of progressive in terms of gender, but often his stuff has been, right? But like there's a lot of like sexually deviant, or sort of like just coded in this way of like, it always leaves me kind of a little bit like, what's going on there?
I don't know, because that stuff is less problematic for me, just in so much as I feel as if that's a button he's been pushing. You go all the way back to Judge Dredd days, right? Like the whole idea of the thing that's fascinating about Judge Dredd, in the same way as the original Dirty Harry film is how much is it playing around with the appeal of fascism.
Fascism, yes. So, and also the ultimate straight.
I don't know if that's, I think that's something he's just, that's just I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I don't know. A bad play. Like, I can see how some people nowadays would, well, a lot of people come at that from a different, and it's this kind of horrible.
Well, I guess I should ask, did you read past those 6 issues? Did you touch any of the rest of it?
I certainly did.
Okay, all right. Because it gets worse. I think that's maybe like there's not, this does not get better. It considerably gets worse as it goes. It gets broader and broader, and And yeah, and it's maybe later on when it gets really into this kind of like lots of stuff around teen sidekicks and and this whole it's just this kind of element, which again, yes, we all know, we all get it, Batman and Robin, it is, that, but the joke is that's what Frederick Wortham was saying in his book, was like, this is all the gay male agenda of the 50s, like this is trying to normalize this stuff, right? But then, so it's weird to have Pat Mills basically trotting it out again, and kind of, I don't know, as I said, I don't think that stuff's aged terribly well, and it hasn't aged terribly well in Slain either, when it starts to show up there too. Like, he still has to think of like the manly man's man who is heterosexual, and then this kind of deviant sexuality, which is quoted as bad in a lot of these stories. Now, I'm sure somewhere Pat Mills has written some positive gay characters, but it's just not in martial law that I could see, and not in Slain.
I mean, I like I said, you probably know what you're talking about more than I. It's not something that jumped out at me, I have to admit.
Yeah, and in these first 6, I think you're right. I think maybe it probably shows up in stuff that I kept going, which is probably why I have even less, because I read stuff I hadn't read at all back then. And so that was even more like, ooh, wow, this went off the rails. It wasn't really on the rails in these first 6 issues, and then it goes way further off the rails the further it goes.
So, apart from us two complaining old gits, I mean,
yes,
what's the status, do you think, within comics fandom now of martial law? Like, have a lot of people come to the same conclusion that it hasn't dated well, or is it still kind of quite revered, or like where? Like, I mean, you mentioned, for instance, the boy, and I know the boys is based on something else, but clearly,
yes, yeah,
that something else is in this.
Yeah, that genre of superhero deconstruction and superhero as asshole.
Yeah, which is
kind of
something, I don't know. It's like, again, I haven't read everything, and I haven't. But if the kind of high watermarks, like you said, is supposed to be stuff like Watchmen and Killing Joke and stuff like, I at the same time had enough of it. I'm bored of this concept. But also wonder, has anyone properly done it justice? Like, because even Watchmen, for me, I mean, Watchmen is good, and
yes,
again, you have to account for how times have changed and stuff like that, and you have to give it the benefit of it. It's a good graphic novel.
It is good, yeah.
But it's not. I don't know.
It's not the last word.
No, and I don't know. A lot of this stuff still seems to me a little bit, because the one thing I suppose I not liked about, but the potential of martial law, and again, this ties in with how Kevin O'Neill draws it as well. I do quite like the like, it's nastier than Watchmen. Like, I quite like the idea of it, of having these kind of, basically psychotic superheroes, like gods, right. like
yeah.
I do like that idea, but these, and in Watchmen even more so than this, they still seem a little bit too enthralled by superheroes. Like, like on the one hand they wanted, but at the same time they did grow up, reading.
Yes, for sure.
I'd quite like to see a take on by someone who actively
hates them. Well, I do feel like martial law gets closer to that than maybe anything else.
Well, that's why that's the element that I almost like, is this is like, if there wasn't that hectoring tone with all the other stuff.
Yes, it really is, and that's one thing that he was given a bit freer hand, I think, later on too, to really create analog characters for, like, well known. So there are much clearer Batman and Punisher and Spider-Man kind of characters that show up later on, so that martial law can kill them. And I'm sure that was at some level vicarious fun for people to, who were frustrated with. It was a superhero comic for people who didn't like superheroes.
Right.
And
I suppose you could argue, well, if you really don't like superheroes, then
why are you reading a superhero comic at all?
Even, yeah.
Yes,
so there's that.
Yeah. go read a comic about ramen making, you know, by some like I still love the fact that Japanese comics have such a broader set of subject areas that they're willing to deal with. I find the hang up in North America with the superhero really has like hamstrung, you know, the industry. Like, right? It's never going to have the reach that the Japanese comic industry has. Just by virtue of the fact you can do a comic about a dude who just hammers nails really well on work sites in the 70s in Japan, and that's like that's a great comic. Let's read about, you know, Hanzo the fast nailer.
Right. But it still seems to. I know there's a greater range of comics out there now than there was before.
Yes.
But I know what you mean. It still seems a little bit like, and I suppose it's to do with what bleeds over into other. So you're not getting movies about those things. You're getting movies about the fucking superheroes, right?
Well, yes, and I, that's so maybe actually I was going to say this before when you brought up this whole idea of this period of time is kind of revered, as you were saying. I think maybe the reason we're seeing it back now is because there was going to be an inevitable backlash to the film versions of all of this, like this MCU, DCEU, this whole thing, right? That people were like, oh yeah, okay, so now we're doing those 60s stories like on the big screen in a very straight-faced kind of way. And then on TV, people are like, well, now let's look back at that 80s, you know, revisionist version of that shit, and let's make the TV shows about that. Right. It's the same. Right. The same. It's the same arc happening again, but now on screen rather than in comic.
Right. Yeah, I suppose it'll be. Let's see what. Or let's not see. Let's ignore it and.
Yes. Let's hope that it all goes away.
Ramen comics. Yeah. Okay. So we'll be back with some ramen comics next time. Maybe something like that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so there you go. R.I.P. Kevin O'Neill.
Yes. Check out all of his work. Don't start here.
No,
start with Nemesis.
Fucking great.
Yes.
Martial law isn't.
Yeah.
Right.
Not the place to begin with, Ken.
See you then.
Take care.